Every night my daughter would go into my wife's room. One day I installed a camera to make sure my wife was still safe. But when I opened the footage and saw the truth, I was so shocked I couldn't breathe. There was no blood, no sound. The video played in silence, and in that silence, I felt that my family was no longer a family. Hello everyone, welcome to today's story. Before we begin, tell me where you're watching from and whether you've ever questioned the silence in your own home. Don't forget to like and subscribe. This is a fictional story with added details for deeper, meaningful, and enriching experience. They say a building is only as strong as its foundation, but standing 50 stories above Minneapolis, I realized I'd spent 30 years building steel monuments, while my own home was rotting from the inside out. My name is Thane Garrison, a 55-year-old senior project manager who spent 30 years building the skyline of Minneapolis, never suspecting that the most dangerous structural failure was happening inside my own home. My life has been measured in blueprints, load-bearing capacities, and the cold, unyielding precision of architectural-grade steel. My professional portfolio is worth $28 million, a figure built on the fact that I never missed a measurement and never tolerated a flaw. But as I leaned against the glass of the observation deck, the cold wind at 50 stories whistling through the seams of the newly installed panels, I felt a tremor that had nothing to do with the wind load. For over a decade, I have been a ghost in my own life, a man who knows the thread counts of the Ritz-Carlton sheets better than the pattern of his own bedspread. I have spent more time in hotel rooms than in my own bed, sacrificing the warmth of a dinner table for the sterile efficiency of a construction site office. I convinced myself that the $28 million was a shield, a structural reinforcement for the family I left behind in Edina. I told myself that my wife Alara understood the cost of the Garrison legacy, and that my daughter Leonie was proud of the towers her father raised. I believed that as long as the money kept flowing and the foundations remained level, the inhabitants of my life were safe and satisfied. I was a master builder after all. I knew how to manage stress, how to compensate for shifting soil, and how to ensure that everything stayed upright. Have you ever looked at a finished structure and wondered which brick would be the first to fail? I should have asked that about my own daughter. Looking out over the city, the smell of ozone and wet concrete from a nearby pouring site filled my lungs, a scent that usually brought me a sense of peace. Now it just felt heavy. I checked the gold watch on my wrist, a heavy $26,000 weight that felt like a shackle today. I was wrapping up a grueling 3-week stint on a Denver skyscraper project, my mind already drifting toward the flight home. Tomorrow was my 26th anniversary with Alara, 26 years of her being my anchor while I sailed into every storm that promised a higher profit margin. She deserved more than just roses this time. She deserved the man she married, not the project manager who merely visited her between deadlines. I had bought a luxury sapphire necklace in Denver, a piece of jewelry that cost more than most people's homes, convinced that this shimmering blue stone would somehow make up for the thousands of hours I'd been absent. I checked my phone for the 3rd time in an hour. Lainey had sent a short text earlier saying everything was fine at home, but her voice had sounded different on our last call. There was a brittleness to her tone, a lack of the usual warmth that I'd attributed to her just being busy. I pushed the doubt aside, trusting in the stability of the house I'd built. Then the phone buzzed. A ghost in my pocket. It was a notification for a missed call and a voicemail from Alara's phone recorded at 3 in the morning the previous night. My thumb hovered over the screen, the static hiss of a low-quality recording already playing in my mind before I even hit the button. I hadn't heard the phone ring in my hotel room. When the message started, there was no greeting, no anniversary wish, just a hollow silence followed by the sound of muffled, desperate crying. My heart hammered against my ribs, a rhythmic thumping that sounded like a piledriver on a hollow site. Behind the sobbing, there was a voice, a low, flat stranger's voice that didn't belong in my house while I was gone. It was barely a whisper, a sound that made the hair on my neck stand up. I played the message again, straining to hear the voice in the background, a voice that didn't belong in my house while I was gone. The wheels of the Gulf Stream slammed onto the tarmac with a violence that matched the storm in my chest, every second of the taxi to the terminal feeling like an hour stolen from Alara's life. I didn't wait for the stairs to fully settle before I was out of the cabin, the crisp Minnesota air biting at my lungs. Jerry, my driver, was standing by the black SUV, but I didn't give him a chance to open the door. "I don't have time for the scenic route, Jerry. Give me the keys," I said, my voice like a serrated blade. He didn't argue. He saw the fire in my eyes and handed over the fob. I threw myself into the driver's seat, and the tires shrieked as I peeled away from the private hangar, leaving a cloud of white smoke in the moonlight. 30 miles to the front door. Just hold on, Alara. I merged onto Highway 62, weaving through the late evening traffic with a reckless precision I usually reserved for high-stakes site inspections. The 3 a.m. voicemail looped in my head, a haunting soundtrack of muffled sobs and that low, flat stranger's voice. I ran through the logistics of my home security as the mile markers blurred past. I had spent a fortune on motion sensors and reinforced glass, but I realized with a sickening jolt that I'd left too much trust in the hands of others. I had built a fortress, but I was beginning to fear I had locked my wife inside it with a ghost. You spend your life building walls to keep the world out, but you never think about what happens when the poison is already inside the room. I turned into the gated community in Adina, the SUV bumping over the curb as I accelerated toward our property. The long winding driveway was flanked by skeletal trees, their shadows stretching across the light snowfall like reaching fingers. As the house came into view, my heart sank. It was too dark for an anniversary night. Usually Alara had the entire facade illuminated warm gold spilling from every window to welcome me home. Tonight, only a single flickering light in the upstairs hallway offered any sign of life. I slammed the brakes and barely waited for the engine to die before I was at the front door. I reached for my keys, but my hand stopped. The door was unlocked, unheard of for my security-obsessed household. Someone had been in such a hurry to enter or leave they forgot the deadbolt. I pushed it open, dropping my leather bags on the marble floor with a hollow echo. I was immediately hit by a heavy medicinal smell, antiseptic and stale tea that didn't belong in my home. Ilara Leone. "I'm home early," I called out, but only the wind whistling through the chimney answered me. "Why is it so cold in here?" I moved toward the living room, my boots clicking rhythmically against the hardwood. My wife, Ilara Garrison, 52, sat staring at the garden we had planted together, a ghost of the woman who once commanded every room she entered. She was sitting in a high-backed velvet chair wearing a deep emerald designer gown that hung off her frame as if she had shrunk. Her skin looked gray and translucent, almost papery under the dim, recessed lighting. "Happy anniversary, sweetheart." "I brought the red ones," I whispered, stepping into her line of sight with the bouquet of roses. She flinches away as if I were a stranger, her eyes glassy and unfocused. She didn't look at the flowers. She looked through me. The roses hit the floor. Red petals scattered like blood on the white marble. Who are you?" Leonie said. "No visitors tonight?" She rasped, her voice a fragile shadow of the melodic tone I loved. I reached out, taking her dry, cold hand in mine, desperate for a spark of recognition. As I pulled her sleeve back slightly to find her pulse, I froze. Deep circular bruising was hidden under the silk, looking like someone had held her down with force. The woman who once ran an empire couldn't even recognize her own husband, but the bruises on her wrist told a story that her lips couldn't find the words for. The sharp click-clack of designer heels against the marble foyer cut through the silence like a jackhammer, snapping Alara's head toward the door with a look of terror in her trembling pupils that chilled my marrow. Standing there was Leonie Garrison, my 25-year-old daughter. Her eyes filled with a concern so polished it should have been my first warning sign. She froze for a heartbeat, her hand tightening around a leather folio. "Dad," You weren't supposed to be home until tomorrow," she said, her voice dropping into a register of practiced sorrow. She was across the room in a blur of silk, physically stepping between me and Alara, effectively breaking the contact I was trying to establish. Before I could ask about the bruises I had seen on Alara's wrist, Leonie was already delivering the blow. "It's early onset Thane. Dr. Boyd says it is aggressive. I have been doing everything myself for the last month, so you could focus on the Denver build. I didn't want to break you while you were managing that skyscraper project." I stood there, the anniversary roses still scattered on the floor, like a bloodstain on the white stone, watching my daughter reveal that she had already obtained a temporary power of attorney while I was away. She claimed it was medically necessary for immediate treatments, a legal bypass she had engineered while I was 3 states away, trusting her with my life's anchor. I watched her movements, noting how she treated Alara like a broken piece of furniture. Rather than a mother, her touch efficient, but devoid of the warmth a child should show a parent in decline. Have you ever seen a structure that looks perfect on the outside, but your gut tells you the load-bearing walls are made of cardboard? That was my daughter's voice. She produced a thick folder, the crinkle of medical-grade paper filling the room, as she showed me pills and schedules. She dismissed the bruises I saw as simple clumsiness, from a loss of motor control, a side effect of the aggressive decline. I tried to look back at Alara to find the woman who once ran a gallery with an iron will, but Leonie was already guiding her toward the stairs. "Don't push her, Dad. You'll just trigger another episode. She needs to go to bed immediately." Overstimulation at this hour leads to sundowning symptoms. I reached out to touch Alara's shoulder, but she flinched again, her vacant gaze fixed on Leonie, as if she were a prison guard rather than a caretaker. The clinical smell of the new pill bottles on the side table was suffocating, a chemical scent that had completely replaced the lavender perfume Alara had worn for 2 decades. Leonie's efficiency was terrifying. She informed me that she had already moved my things to the guest room, insisting that Alara needed a consistent sleep environment, without the interruption of a partner who had been gone for weeks. I felt the aggressive coldness of the guest room sheets as I finally sat on the edge of the bed later that night, the house around me feeling like a hollowed-out shell. Diagnosis: Alzheimer's. My mind screamed, lie. I have spent my life reading blueprints looking for the one weak point that could bring down $100 million of investment. There was a structural failure in Leonie's story, a hairline crack that she hadn't managed to plaster over. I opened the medical folder she had left on the hallway table, my hands steady even as my heart raced. My eyes locked onto the signature of the prescribing physician. Dr. Kenneth Boyd. It was a name that made the hair on my neck stand up. I remembered him from 5 years ago, a specialist I once blacklisted from a major construction site for forging safety inspections and taking kickbacks from contractors. Leonie's perfect medical report was signed by a man I knew would sell his soul for a decimal point in the right place. And suddenly the bruises on Alara's arm looked like a crime scene. Sleep didn't come to a man who specialized in structural integrity when he suspected his own family's foundation was built on shifting sand and lies. I lay fully clothed on the guest room bed, staring at the ceiling fan as it sliced through the stagnant air in a hypnotic, useless rhythm. My ears were tuned to the internal hum of the Adena estate, every groan of the floorboards and hiss of the air conditioning analyzed with a project manager's precision. I couldn't stop thinking about Boyd. What did you promise her to sign that report? Kenneth, a man like Boyd, didn't just stumble into a family tragedy. He was invited usually by someone with something to hide. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the temperature. The silence in this house used to be peaceful, a reward for the months spent on loud, chaotic sites. Now it felt like a physical weight, thick and suffocating. As I reached for the door handle to inspect the hallway, my hand brushed against the metal. I froze. The sharp, metallic scent of the hallway smart locks was new. I realized then that Leonie had replaced all the original hardware on Alara's room with smart locks that only she could control via an app on her phone. She hadn't just secured the room. She had partitioned it from me. It was 1:45 a.m. when the first movement broke the stillness. I heard the distinct click of a door and soft, rhythmic footsteps, the kind of practiced creep that suggested this wasn't the first time. I opened the guest room door an inch, the cold floorboards biting against my bare feet. A shadow moved across the blue glow of a distant nightlight. It was Leonie. She didn't turn on the main lights, which was my first red flag. A doting daughter caring for a sick mother in the middle of the night usually needs to see what she is doing. I watched as she slipped into the master bedroom, the door sealing shut behind her, with a soft, electronic beep of the new lock. I started a mental countdown. 1 minute. 5. 10. My mind looped through the possibilities, but none of them sat right. 20 minutes. What could she be doing in there for 20 minutes in total darkness? Move Thane. See for yourself. Do you know what it feels like to realize the person you'd take a bullet for is the one pulling the trigger? I crept down the hall, my heart a dull hammer against my ribs, until I was standing right outside the door that used to lead to my sanctuary. I waited. The silence from behind the door was worse than any noise could have been. Finally, 40 minutes after she entered, the latch clicked. Leonie emerged, nearly jumping out of her skin, as she saw me standing in the hallway shadows. Her doting daughter persona vanished instantly, the grief-stricken mask replaced by a sharp, defensive hostility. "What were you doing in there for 40 minutes, Leonie?" I asked, my voice a low, analytical rasp. She didn't even blink. She stepped toward me, her face inches from mine, assisting with an accident Thane. Something you wouldn't know anything about since you were too busy building towers in Denver to care about your wife's dignity. Her eyes, they weren't blue anymore. They were cold, hard steel, reflecting a version of my daughter I didn't recognize. She wasn't finished. Before I could demand to see Alara, she pulled a folded paper from the pocket of her robe, a pre-signed medical directive. "This states that your presence distresses the patient in her current state." She whispered, her voice like sandpaper. "If you interfere again, or try to force your way into that room, I have the legal authority to have you removed from this house tonight." I looked at the paper, then at the girl I'd raised, and realized I was standing on a site that had already collapsed. She wasn't just taking care of her mother. She was building a cage, and she'd just handed me the eviction notice for my own life. I waited until the soft click of Leonie's door signaled she'd finally retired before I crept into the kitchen, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird as I began to sift through the remains of our family's life in the trash. The silence of the house was absolute, yet it shrieked with the weight of the secrets I was unearthing. I pulled the heavy plastic trash bags from the bin, the rustle echoing in the cavernous room like thunder. My hands, usually steady enough to calibrate a laser level, trembled as I encountered the smell of stale coffee grounds and sour milk. Digging deeper, I found a receipt for a high-end document shredder purchased the very day I left for Denver, a detail that sat in my gut like lead. Leonie was systematically destroying something: records, memories, perhaps evidence. Then, buried beneath a pile of junk mail, I found a crumpled notice from a high-stakes underground casino. It was a collection demand for a $150,000 personal loan. $150,000. My daughter, the girl I had provided everything for, was bleeding money into a void. Beside the notice lay 3 empty glass vials. They weren't the Alzheimer's medication Leonie had shown me. They were a powerful sedative, the cold, sticky residue on the glass clinging to my skin like a curse. This wasn't healthcare. This was a chemical leash. You think you know your own flesh and blood until you find their name on a debt note that costs more than a human life. The realization that my daughter was financing a gambling addiction with her mother's vitality turned my stomach into a knot of cold fury. I sat on the kitchen floor until the first gray streaks of dawn bled through the windows, feeling more like a scavenger than a master builder. By 8 o'clock, I was in the breakfast nook, watching Alara try to eat. The rattle of a silver spoon against a china bowl was the only sound in the room. Her hands, once capable of restoring delicate oil paintings, were now trembling, blue-veined things that couldn't even manage a mouthful of oatmeal. She was falling apart at a rate that defied any natural logic. People don't just disappear while they're still breathing. Leonie, I said, my voice thick with suppressed rage. Leonie didn't even look up from her tablet, her clinical efficiency, as she wiped a spill from Alara's chin, making my skin crawl. "It's a degenerative condition, Dad," she replied with that sharp, brittle tone. "Maybe if you'd been here you wouldn't be so surprised." She spoke as if Alara were a faulty appliance, an inconvenience to be managed, rather than a woman to be loved. I couldn't stay in that room. I needed to see Alara in the sun, away from the medicinal gloom of the house. I helped her into the garden, her body feeling as light and fragile as balsa wood. We had only taken a few steps across the manicured lawn when her muscles simply gave out. She collapsed against me, a dead weight that I barely managed to catch. Alara wasn't just sick. She was a skyscraper whose support beams were being sawn through in the dark. I lowered her onto a stone bench, looking into her eyes. For a split second, the fog cleared. "Thane," she whispered, her voice a ghost of a rasp. "Make it stop. Please." The clarity broke my heart into 1,000 jagged pieces. "I'm going to fix this, Alara. I promise." As I gathered her into my arms to carry her back inside, my hand brushed against the hem of her designer gown. I felt something small and hard hidden in the stitching. I reached in and pulled out a miniature digital recorder. It had been crushed, the plastic casing splintered, and the internal chips snapped with deliberate force. Alara had tried to record someone, and it had been found and destroyed, leaving her with nothing but the bruises on her soul. I adjusted my tie in the reflection of the clinic's glass doors, smoothing out the rage that threatened to crack my professional veneer before I stepped inside to confront the man who had signed my wife's mental death warrant. The antiseptic sting of the clinic air hit me instantly, a sharp chemical contrast to the smell of wood smoke and autumn I'd left outside. I walked across the linoleum, the squeak of my rubber soles echoing like a warning. A cold, efficient receptionist tried to block my path, her eyes fixed on a digital monitor. "Mr. Garrison, you can't just walk back there," she said, her voice a flat monotone. "The doctor is with a patient." I didn't stop. "I'm not here for an appointment. I'm here for the truth. Get Boyd out here," I replied, leaning over her desk just enough to let her see the authority I'd honed on 40 construction sites. I reminded her that I was the primary health insurance holder and the legal spouse. I scanned the layout while she scrambled to make a call. The place didn't feel like a neurological center. It felt like a private clubhouse, hushed and over-decorated, designed to keep the outside world at a comfortable distance. Within minutes, the man himself appeared. Dr. Kenneth Boyd, a 63-year-old neurologist, with a smile that never reached his predatory eyes, stood behind a mahogany desk that cost more than a nurse's yearly salary when we eventually settled into his private office. He projected an air of manufactured empathy that I found revolting. He began recycling the same Alzheimer's script I'd heard from Leonie, citing atypical rapid onset and high-stress triggers. I sat there, my hands clasped tightly in my lap to hide the tension. How much does it cost to buy a doctor's signature? In Minneapolis, apparently, it was a piece of jewelry and my wife's sanity. I noticed a high-end luxury watch on Boyd's wrist, the exact limited edition model Leonie had bragged about buying for a special client last month. The gold glint of the watch face under the office lights was a beacon of corruption. I pushed him for the digital lab results, my voice a low, dangerous rumble. "I build skyscrapers, doctor. I know when a report has been doctored to hide a structural failure. I want the raw data." He didn't flinch, but his eyes shifted to the cold glass of the office window. "There's been a server glitch, Thane. It's temporarily locked the records. I'll email them to you later tonight." It was a lie I'd heard 100 times from crooked contractors, and it confirmed everything. I allowed him to escort me toward the exit, playing the part of the frustrated but defeated husband. As I passed a side employee entrance, I spotted a flash of familiar blonde hair. I ducked back into a small alcove, my heart hammering against my ribs. Leonie was walking through that side door, bypassing the waiting room entirely. I watched as she greeted Dr. Boyd in the hallway. Then she touched him. Not a daughter's touch, a lover's. She reached out and adjusted Boyd's collar with a proprietary flick of her fingers, and they shared a look of familiar predatory intimacy that made my skin crawl. It wasn't professional. It was a partnership. Is he gone? Did he buy it? I heard her whisper the hush of their conspiracy carrying clearly in the quiet corridor. Boyd chuckled, a sound like dry leaves skittering on pavement. He's suspicious, Leonie. We need to accelerate the timeline. He reached into his lab coat and handed her a fresh batch of unlabeled vials. Here, sweetheart. Keep her steady. My own daughter was standing there receiving a chemical arsenal from a man she was sleeping with to destroy the mother who had given her everything. Seeing my daughter's hand on that man's chest made my stomach turn, but it gave me the one thing I needed: a target for the cameras I was about to install. I sat in the silence of my SUV, the Minneapolis skyline, taunting me with its orderly beauty, while I calculated the cost of turning my own home into a high-stakes interrogation room. The image of Leonie's hand on Dr. Boyd's chest was burned into my retinas like a welding flash, a jagged white scar on my memory that refused to fade. I gripped the steering wheel until the leather groaned, forcing my breathing into the rhythmic, shallow pattern I used when a site inspection went south. My daughter was no longer just a doting caretaker. She was an operative in a coordinated assault on the woman I loved. I needed eyes where I was blind. I needed a recording that couldn't be disputed by a disgraced doctor's forged medical charts. The glare of the late afternoon sun on the windshield blinded me for a second as I pulled out of the clinic parking lot heading south toward Bloomington. I wasn't looking for a retail security solution. I was looking for industrial-grade betrayal. I pulled up to a nondescript storefront, nestled between a specialized plumbing wholesaler and a high-end data recovery firm. The shop had no flashy neon signs, just a small etched plate on the glass. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of solder and static, the low hum of server fans providing a constant white noise soundtrack to the business of secrets. A young clerk with tired eyes looked up from a circuit board. I didn't wait for a greeting. I need 24-hour remote access, encrypted server storage, and no physical lights on the units. I said, my voice cutting through the electronic hum. He paused, recognizing me from a business journal article I'd seen on his counter earlier. Mr. Garrison, right? I saw your latest tower project. I ignored the pleasantry, my focus purely tactical. This isn't for a nursery kid. I'm securing a high-value asset against a persistent threat. He nodded slowly, then dropped a bombshell that nearly knocked me off my foundation. He mentioned that a young woman matching Leonie's description had been in the store 3 weeks ago, asking specifically about the effective range of high-frequency signal jammers. My skin crawled as the implications settled into my bones. Have you ever felt the skin on your neck crawl when you realize the predator you're hunting has already been hunting you? Leonie hadn't just been planning a poisoning. She had been researching how to blind me before I even knew there was a fight. I meticulously selected my Arsenal 4K micro cameras, disguised as smoke detectors, a phone charger for the kitchen, and a nondescript digital alarm clock for Alara's nightstand that looked identical to the one she'd owned for years. The cold plastic of the micro camera lenses felt like ice in my hand. I paid in cash, pulling the bills from a private reserve I kept for site emergencies, ensuring no digital paper trail would ever alert the family accountants or the daughter who watched them like a hawk. My phone vibrated against my sweaty palm, the screen flashing Leonie's name. I took a breath, letting the project manager persona slide over my rage like a protective shroud. Hey, sweetheart, I said, my voice steady enough to fool a lie detector. I'm just tied up reviewing site permits for the new phase. I'll be back for dinner. Her reply was saccharine, but I could hear the new edge of confidence beneath the warmth. Don't rush back. The black bag of cameras on the passenger seat felt heavier than 100 tons of structural steel. It was a weight of proof, a burden of truth. I wasn't sure I was ready to carry, but I had no choice left. As I walked back to the SUV, I opened the demo app on my phone to test the receiver sync. A notification popped up immediately, showing an active unauthorized Bluetooth signal broadcasting from the undercarriage of my own vehicle. My heart stopped. It was a localized tracker, a small magnetic leech fed by my own car's battery. My daughter hadn't just occupied the house. She'd turned my own tools against me, and now I had to figure out how to install my eyes without her seeing the blink. I didn't head straight for the driveway. Instead, I pulled into a muddy construction site 2 miles away, crawling under my own SUV with a flashlight between my teeth, to rip out the digital parasite my daughter had used to tether me to her lies. The metallic tang of the flashlight casing was bitter against my tongue, a reminder of the foul game I was now forced to play. I felt the grit of mud and road salt on the undercarriage as I located the small magnetic leech near the rear axle. My heart hammered against my ribs, but my hands remained the steady tools of an engineer. I didn't just smash it. I saw a long-haul delivery truck idling near the site entrance, and with a calculated flick of the wrist, I attached the tracker to its chassis. Follow that truck to St. Paul Leone. I'm going off the grid. I had exactly 30 minutes before their specialist session with Alara was scheduled to end a window narrower than the tolerances on a high-speed rail line. I drove a secondary route avoiding every main thoroughfare and parked my SUV 3 blocks away under the cover of a weeping willow. I entered the estate through the wooded perimeter, where I'd played as a child, the familiar scent of damp pine needles doing nothing to soothe the adrenaline flooding my system. I slipped through the basement utility door, moving with the silence of a man who knew every joist and beam of the house he'd paid for. I ascended the stairs, my ears straining for the slightest sound. I realized immediately that the atmosphere in the master bedroom had changed. Leonie hadn't just been asking about signal jammers. She had already installed a professional-grade white noise generator. The high-pitched whine was subtle, a steady hiss that was designed to mask any sounds of struggle or loud, desperate conversation. It made the air feel thick, pressurized. Click. The house felt like it was breathing with me. Or maybe it was just the vents. I didn't have time to dwell on the violation. I moved to the kitchen, installing a micro camera inside a hollowed-out ventilation grate that gave me a perfect view of the breakfast nook. Then I hurried back to the master suite. The smell of cedar oil Alara loved was still there, but it felt tainted now. Forgive me, Alara. I have to be your eyes because they've stolen your own. My hands were trembling as I opened the casing of the high-end designer clock on her nightstand, fitting the 4K lens into a gap no larger than a pinhead. Focus on the connection. Syncing. 10%, 50, done. My engineering mind fought against the visceral disgust of spying on my own wife's most vulnerable moments, but the alternative was leaving her to drown in the dark. I was the architect of this house, but today, I was its ghost, haunting the halls I'd paid for with 30 years of sweat. I made one final sweep of the nightstand, checking for anything Leonie might have missed. My fingers brushed against a hidden latch I'd built into the back of the drawer years ago, a place Alara kept her private journals. I slid it open expecting a diary, but my breath hitched in my throat. I found a stack of pre-filled death certificate drafts. Everything was there. Her name, her date of birth, the cause of death listed as cardiac arrest, secondary to neurodegenerative complications. Everything was filled out in black ink, except for the final date of passing. My own daughter had already planned the funeral while the body was still warm. The gravel crunched in the driveway. Leonie was home early, and I was still standing in the middle of the master bedroom with a handful of my wife's death warrants. I shoved the death warrants into the small of my back under my belt, just as the master bedroom door swung open with a predatory creak that signaled the end of my invisibility. The sharp crinkle of the warrants against my skin felt like a live wire, but I didn't have time to flinch. I scrambled away from the nightstand, snatching a hand towel from the ensuite rack as I turned to face the room. Leonie stood in the doorway, her frame backlit by the hall lights, her eyes narrowing as they swept over the furniture I had just violated. "I'm leaving now, Leonie. The Denver Foundation is cracking. I don't have time for a debrief," I said, my voice projecting the high pressure, authoritative snap I usually reserved for stalling subcontractors on a failing job site. My heart was a drum against my ribs, but I kept my breathing level. "You look flushed, Dad. Are you sure you're feeling all right to fly?" she asked, her tone dripping with a concern that I now recognized as a diagnostic probe. I brushed past her, the smell of her expensive floral perfume cloying in the small space. "I'm fine. I just need to get this build back on schedule." I made a show of checking a fake notification on my phone, muttering about site permits, to keep her eyes off the newly installed camera hidden in the clock. I realized then that I wasn't just leaving for a business trip. I was leaving a battlefield. Leonie had already mentioned a specialized private estate cleaning service arriving the day after tomorrow. A crew I knew from my work was usually booked to scrub a home after a resident passed away. The blueprint was finished. She was just waiting for the concrete to set. The next morning, the performance reached its final act on the front porch. I stood in the doorway, putting on the mask of a doting father and a weary husband for the benefit of whatever trackers Leonie still had active. I bent down to kiss Alara goodbye, feeling the unnatural coldness of her skin and the frantic, shallow pulse in her wrist. She looked through me, her eyes clouded by whatever chemical leash Leonie was tightening. I reached into my pocket and handed Leonie a large roll of cash, a heavy stack intended for emergency medical expenses. I watched her fingers twitch with a greed she couldn't quite suppress as she tucked the money away. "Take care of her, Leonie. She's everything to me," I said, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. "Don't worry about a thing, Dad. Everything is under control," she replied, smiling with a warmth that chilled my spine. Have you ever looked into the eyes of your own child and realized you were looking at a stranger with a blueprint for your destruction? I walked to my SUV without looking back, knowing that if my cameras failed, I might never see Alara breathe again. I drove to the airport in a fugue state, the weight of the death warrant still pressed against my spine. I didn't stop until I was strapped into the leather seat of my private jet. The hangar door closed. The world I knew stayed outside. As the engines began their low-frequency vibration and the plane reached cruising altitude, I pulled my smartphone from my jacket. My hands were finally shaking as I opened the encrypted app. The 4K feed was crystal clear, a window into the Adina estate that Leonie didn't know existed. The master bedroom was empty, the white noise generator probably still hissing in the silence. I switched the view to the kitchen and felt the air leave my lungs. Leonie wasn't caring for her mother. She was in the kitchen, her movements fluid and buoyant as she danced to a rhythm only she could hear. She reached into the wine cellar and pulled out an expensive vintage I'd been saving, popping the cork with a celebratory sound that carried perfectly through the micro mic. She poured a glass, her face lit by the icy blue glow of her own phone on the counter. She was talking to someone on speakerphone, her laughter jagged and cold. "We're in the home stretch," she said, her voice dripping with anticipation. "Dr. Boyd is ready." The 4K feed was crystal clear, and as I watched Leonie lift her glass to the camera she didn't know was there, I heard the voice from the 3 a.m. voicemail finally identify itself on the other end of the line, discussing the payout. The altitude of the plane felt like a cruel joke. I was closer to heaven than ever, yet I was staring into the very pit of hell through a 4-inch glass screen. I gripped the armrests of my seat in the darkened cabin, the thin metallic hiss of the oxygen system sounding like a long, drawn-out sigh of despair. On the tablet propped on my tray table, the 4K feed was so sharp it felt like I could reach out and touch the marble countertops of my own kitchen. Leonie was still there, leaning over her phone on speakerphone, And then the voice on the other end spoke again. My blood turned to ice. Ethan Clark, a 30-year-old, with a razor-thin conscience and a mind for corporate theft, was the man I had stripped of his career 3 years ago. Now he was trying to strip me of my family. I remembered him as the aggressive young analyst I'd fired for corporate espionage, the one Leonie had recently introduced to me as her financial advisor. She'd claimed he was helping her grow her trust fund, but the conversation I was hearing now had nothing to do with market dividends and everything to do with a liquidation timeline. Is the blueprint ready for the final sign-off? Leonie Ethan's voice asked, crackling through the iPad's small speakers. Leonie didn't even look up from the wine glass she was swirling. He's in the air, Ethan. The house is quiet. It's time to close the contract, she replied. I hit the record button on the app, my hands shaking with a cold, predatory fury as I realized they weren't just taking my money. They were taking my life's foundation. I watched as Leonie set the wine glass down and moved toward the kitchen cabinets with a purpose that made my stomach churn. She reached into a hidden compartment I had built under the primary cabinet, a space I'd originally intended for the deed to the house, and pulled out a porcelain mortar and pestle. If you ever think you know what evil looks like, look at the face of a child smiling as they prepare their parents' last meal. She began to unpack several distinct types of pills from a nondescript plastic bag. I watched paralyzed by a clinical horror as she placed 3 white tablets and 2 blue ones into the bowl. The grinding sound of the mortar against the porcelain was faint, but distinct, a rhythmic, bone-chilling scratch that signaled the end of Ilara's lucidity. Leonie's hands were steady, the hands of a professional builder turned professional killer. She wasn't just crushing medication. She was crushing Ilara's ability to fight back, preparing a chemical leash of sedatives and scopolamine that would induce the perfect imitation of a terminal fog. Just a little more sweetness for you, Mom. For your memory, she whispered to the empty room. I'm the only one who takes care of you now. She stirred the white powder into a dark amber liquid, her focus absolute. Crush, stir, pour. The mechanics of murder were so simple. It was a structural demolition of a human mind executed with the same precision I used to plan a load-bearing wall. I leaned forward, my face inches from the cold blue glare of the screen. I watched the dark liquid swirl as the powder dissolved, a toxic dark brew that looked like nothing more than an evening comfort. Leonie checked the digital chime of her watch, a sharp sound that echoed in the quiet kitchen. I realized then that this wasn't just a casual evening ritual. It was a synchronized act. She was timing the dosage with Ethan's arrival at the estate's perimeter. The plan was moving at a pace that suggested they had a deadline I hadn't yet calculated. I felt morally shattered, a man who had spent 40 years building safety into the world, only to find that the deadliest threat had been sleeping under his own roof. Leonie picked up the tray, arranging the cup and a small plate of crackers with a doting care that made me want to scream. She turned toward the master bedroom, the steam from the toxic brew rising like a ghost between her and the woman I loved. I gripped the armrests of my seat so hard, the leather groaned, watching through a 4K lens as Leonie pushed open the master bedroom door, the steam from that poisonous tea curling around her like a shroud. On the screen of my tablet, the image was so clear it felt like a physical violation of the space I had built for Ilara. I saw my wife lying back against the pillows, her movements slow and thick, her eyes already swimming in a chemical haze. Leonie didn't hesitate. She sat on the edge of the bed and forced a dazed Ilara to sit up, holding the porcelain cup to her lips with a tenderness that was more terrifying than a blade. Ilara tried to resist, her hand trembling as she pushed weakly at the saucer. It tastes wrong, Leonie. It's metallic. Where is Thane? My wife whispered, her voice a fragile rasp that made my heart shatter. Leonie didn't miss a beat, her face a mask of doting concern as she leaned in closer. Drink it all, Mom. It's just a new honey blend the doctor sent over. You know how the episodes get when you skip your medicine. You're just confused again. I watched as Leonie revealed that she had been intercepting my calls for months, using a voice cloning app to convince Ilara that I was too busy with the Denver build to speak with her. She was erasing me from Ilara's mind, while poisoning her body a double-layered demolition that left me reeling in the cabin of the jet. I watched my wife's final moments of lucidity slip away as she drained the cup. The sedatives were aggressive, and within minutes, Ilara's drug-heavy eyelids began to flutter her head, eventually lolling back against the pillows as her breathing became a shallow, ragged ghost of its former self. Leonie stood over her for a moment, her eyes cold and clinical, before she adjusted the white noise generator. The faint, rhythmic hiss of the machine filled the silence of the room, masking the sounds of the house. Ilara wasn't a person to them anymore. She was just a structural obstacle, a piece of old timber that needed to be cleared for the new build. I sat paralyzed 30,000 feet in the air, watching as a shadow moved across the bedroom floor. Ethan Clark entered the frame through the master balcony doors, his boots making no sound on the heavy rug. He didn't even look at Ilara. His first move was toward the vanity to review a stack of legal documents. They spoke openly now, their voices picked up with terrifying clarity by the micro camera I'd hidden in the clock. "Is she out?" Ethan asked, his voice a flat corporate drone. "We don't have time for her to be confused anymore." Leonie checked Ilara's pulse with a detached efficiency. "The scopolamine is doing its job. She won't remember a thing even if she wakes up," she replied. I felt a cold, lethal focus settle over me, my mind already calculating the logistics of the response I would launch as soon as I touched the ground. How do you sit still in a metal tube at 30,000 feet while a man you once fired discusses the exact date of your wife's funeral? I watched Ethan reach into his jacket and pull out a sterile plastic case. He withdrew a syringe, the light reflecting off the cold, sterile glint of the needle. He explained that the natural stroke would be triggered by an air embolism, a clean, untraceable kill scheduled for the following Tuesday, when the cleaning crew was already booked to scrub the evidence away. He tapped the needle of the syringe, the light reflecting off the deadly bubble of air inside, as he looked at his watch and whispered, "10 days, Leonie. 10 days until we're worth 28 million. I stared at the screen at the bubble that represented the end of my world, and my finger hovered over the satellite phone on the console. The game had changed from surveillance to survival. My thumb hovered over the dial pad of the satellite phone, my vision blurring as I watched that bubble of air in Ethan's syringe, a tiny, translucent executioner waiting for a Tuesday that I was going to make sure never arrived. The leather armrest of my seat felt unnaturally cold against my palm. I was 30,000 feet over Nebraska, trapped in a metal tube, but the digital clarity of the 4K feed made me feel as though I were standing right there in the Adina bedroom, close enough to smell the Earl Grey and the betrayal. I didn't hesitate. I punched in a number I hadn't dialed in 5 years, the plastic click of the satellite phone buttons echoing in the quiet cabin like a countdown. Agent Christine Parker, a 43-year-old federal investigator with a voice like sharpened flint, was the woman who had helped me dismantle a billion-dollar kickback scheme 5 years ago. When she answered, I didn't offer a greeting. "Christine, it's Thane Garrison," I said, my voice as hard as the steel beams I used to inspect. "I'm sending you a link and encrypted credentials. Look at the master bedroom feed immediately." The line crackled for a heartbeat before her professional mask fell away. "I see it, Thane." My God. Is that a sedative cocktail or something worse? It was the moment the floor gave way. Agent Parker revealed that the FBI already had an open file on Ethan Clark for an unrelated offshore money laundering scheme, meaning my evidence was the final piece they needed for a no-knock federal warrant. The predator I was hunting was already on their radar. I had just provided the target acquisition. In construction, you have a contingency for a failed beam or a late shipment. But how do you plan for the moment your own daughter becomes the demolition crew? I stared at the jittery reflection of the phone screen in the jet window. the metallic smell of recycled air filling my lungs. I explained the history of Ethan Clark and the medical fraud involving Dr. Boyd, emphasizing that this wasn't just a family dispute, but a coordinated capital crime aimed at my wife's life and our estate. Agent Parker's tone shifted into a calculated coldness that I recognized and welcomed. She confirmed that the scopolamine and the documented threat of the air embolism moved this into federal jurisdiction. We need a ghost extraction. I told her, my mind already drafting a tactical blueprint. If Leonie sees a siren, she'll empty that syringe before you hit the driveway. I provided her with the structural details of my home, the reinforced doors, the silent alarms, and the entry points Leonie didn't know I still monitored. I knew every joist and crawl space of that estate. I had built it to be a sanctuary, and now I was giving the FBI the map to invade it. The line crackled. Parker's voice turned to ice. We're taking the house, Thane. She began coordinating with a specialized tactical medical team in Minneapolis, ensuring they would be ready to move the moment I landed. We're initiating the protocol now, she continued. You land in 3 hours. We'll have a secure terminal ready for your arrival. I gripped the phone, my knuckles white as the hum of the jet's ventilation seemed to grow louder in the silence. Through the speakers, Leonie's voice drifted again, a hollow sound that didn't belong to the daughter I'd raised. She was discussing the service at the crematorium with Ethan, her words casual and cold. She planned to have Alara cremated immediately following the stroke to destroy any toxicological evidence of the scopolamine. The realization that they had thought of everything, the medical diagnosis, the forged documents, the disposal of the body, made me realize I wasn't just flying home for an anniversary. I was flying into a war zone. I closed my eyes, the coldness of the leather seat seeping into my skin, and prepared for the demolition of the life I had built. I didn't give Leonie the chance to bridge the gap. I moved with the explosive force of a controlled demolition, twisting the steak knife from her hand before her sociopathic brain could even register my presence. She let out a sharp, indignant yelp, but I ignored her, passing the blade to Beckett and leaving him to keep Leonie and Ethan pinned against the stainless steel cabinets of the kitchen. My focus was upstairs, drawn by that weak, rhythmic coughing that signaled the structural failure of my wife's health. I sprinted up the oak staircase, the sounds of the struggle in the kitchen fading behind me. When I reached the master suite, I found the door locked from the outside, a physical manifestation of the cage Leonie had built to keep her mother contained. I didn't reach for my keys. I took a sharp intake of breath, braced my shoulder, and utilized 30 years of knowing exactly where a frame was weakest to hit the door with everything I had. I felt the wood splinter and give way under my weight, the door swinging open to reveal a room that smelled of stale air and chemical decay. I found Alara in the darkness, her skin a sickly gray under the dim moonlight. I'm here, Alara. The builder is back. I whispered, my heart fracturing as I saw her vacant gaze. Thane, she rasped her voice, barely a thread. Is it? Finally Tuesday, I realized then that Leonie had even removed the smoke detectors in the room, stripping away every possible way for Alara to signal the outside world for help. Crash. The door gave way. The lie followed. I didn't waste a second. I pulled a heavy wool duvet from the foot of the bed and wrapped Alara's frail, shivering body in it, lifting her into my arms. I was stunned by how light she had become, as if her very essence had been hollowed out under Leonie's care. As I carried her back toward the stairs, the front doors of the estate were kicked open, and Agent Christine Parker led a flood of FBI agents into the foyer. The blinding blue and red strobe of the police lights outside cut through the house like a searchlight. Thane, we have the medical unit on the perimeter, Parker shouted over the chaos, her voice a steady anchor. I didn't stop to explain. I bypassed the agents who were already zip-tying Ethan in the kitchen, focused only on the frail woman in my arms. Medical, get the dialysis unit prepped now, I roared as I crossed the threshold of my own house, heading for the ambulance idling in the driveway. Leonie was being led out by two officers. Her designer dress rumpled, still screaming at the top of her lungs about my absenteeism and my supposed mental instability. "Don't let them touch her. She's my mother." She shrieked, her face a mask of frantic animalistic greed. "You think a parent's love is unconditional? Try watching your child kill you for a bank balance and see how fast the conditions change." In the driveway, under the artificial glare of industrial floodlights, I signaled for the medical team to pause the gurney for a single moment as Leonie was led past. She was still spewing lies, her voice a jagged glass edge. I reached into my jacket and pulled out my tablet, the cold, digital glow of the screen illuminating the dark. I played the 4K still frame of Leonie meticulously crushing those pills into the tea, holding the evidence inches from her widening eyes, until she finally went silent. "Look at the screen, Leonie. This is the blueprint of your future. It's built of steel bars and concrete floors," I said, my voice as cold as a Minnesota winter. She stared at the image of her own betrayal, her lips trembling. I can explain. Ethan made me." She stammered, the doting daughter act finally disintegrating into a pathetic pile of excuses. As the officers pushed her toward the waiting cruiser, she screamed out that Dr. Boyd was already on a plane to a non-extradition country. I watched her go, knowing she was unaware that I had already coordinated with Agent Parker to intercept the doctor's flight path over the Atlantic. I watched the cruiser pull away, but as I turned back to the ambulance, Agent Parker whispered that the toxins in Alara's blood were even more complex than the initial labs suggested. My hand tightened on Alara's cold fingers as the sirens began to scream. The ambulance didn't just drive. It tore through the midnight streets of Edina, a streak of white and red fury that felt like the only thing keeping my wife's fading heartbeat from flatlining into the Minnesota frost. I gripped Alara's hand inside the swaying high-tech cabin, my eyes fixed on the rhythmic thumping of the floor beneath my boots. The sirens were a jagged scream in the night, yet they were the only music I wanted to hear. A lead paramedic, his face tight with focus, leaned over a monitor. "Her vitals are bottoming out. We need a direct line to toxicology," he shouted. I learned right then that the ambulance Leonie had on standby for her planned Tuesday stroke wasn't a medical vehicle at all, but a private transport owned by one of Ethan Clark's shell companies. It had been a Harzin waiting. "Stay with me, Alara. I just got you back. Don't you dare leave me now," I whispered, though my voice was nearly lost in the metallic howl of the vehicle. I was haunted by the warning Agent Parker had whispered earlier. Complex toxins. I watched the paramedics struggle to stabilize Alara's plummeting blood pressure, and I realized that while I had won the physical battle at our home, the chemical war inside my wife's body was only just reaching its most lethal phase. You spend your life calculating the load-bearing capacity of steel, but nothing prepares you for the moment you have to calculate the survival odds of your own soul. The ambulance slid into the bay of a secure, undisclosed hospital floor, prepped by the FBI, the screech of gurney wheels on polished tiles echoing like a gunshot. The smell of ozone and industrial-grade disinfectant hit me as we moved through the flickering, fluorescent lights of the intake bay. I was abruptly barred from the emergency detox suite as a team of specialists took over. "Mr. Garrison, you need to step back. We are moving to full-body dialysis," a voice commanded. I stood in the hallway pressed against the cold wall, watching through a small glass pane as they initiated a rapid sequence intubation. I watched them work on her, a flurry of blue scrubs and silver instruments, and the isolation felt heavier than any skyscraper I had ever raised. "Tell me she's going to wake up. Just tell me that," I begged a passing nurse. But she didn't even look up. The machinery hummed, the monitors beeped, and I was left with the silence that only exists in hospitals and morgues. Hours bled into the early morning before a doctor finally emerged. Dr. Elena Ortiz, a 50-year-old toxicologist with eyes that had seen the worst of human cruelty, gripped her clipboard like a shield as she approached me. Her face was a mask of exhausted professional concern. It wasn't just a poisoning thane. It was a chemical erasure, she said, her voice dropping into a low, somber tone. She revealed that the complex toxins weren't just simple sedatives. They were a calculated neurodegenerative